I'm Corbett Wall with DV Auction, here with your feeder flash for Monday, March the 18th, where we've got hog help in the cattle market. Finally, hogs have been cheap for a long time. They're an awful good competitor on the protein market to cattle because they do have a good product and it is in direct competition. But hogs have seen a rally here in the last short term there because there's more talk about China starting to import some U.S. pork, and China eats a lot of pork, and God knows there's a lot of people over there to feed it to. But they eat a lot of pork, they raise a lot of pork, and you normally don't get an opportunity to send them any pork, but because of this African swine fever that they've been struggling with for quite a while now, they're getting short enough now that they need some product, and that is a lot of it credited to Trump being able to get relationships going with trade on them, getting some trade imbalances straightened out. And if they start taking pork, then there's a good chance, if that works out good for them and they see how good our protein products are, there's a good chance that they might start getting more interested in importing some of our beef. But let's look at the board. For last week, April live cattle futures ended the week at 129.10. That was down 57 cents for the week. June ended at 121.92, actually up 97 cents for the week, and a lot of your traders and hedgers rolling and moving off into June, so that helped it. April's starting to lose numbers, and June is gaining them. But you see record amounts of open interest means there's a lot of people holding contracts in the live cattle arena. March feeder cattle ended the week at 141.32, down 260 for the week. April at 146.92, down 77 cents for the week. Your fat cattle trade, you remember we had our established market on Wednesday, which we just never see it that early in the week, but with the big storm coming into Nebraska and all the weather and the wind and all that was going on, we did see a dollar lower trade at 127. We saw 203 to mostly 204, which was a pinch lower too on the dress trade, and you saw most everybody that was real anxious to trade go ahead and take that market. But then it was quiet on Thursday. Of course, everybody was trying to soak in all the flooding and devastation and death loss that's going on up in Nebraska. But then we saw packers come in late on Friday, scrambling, trying to get cattle, and in some cases they were needing them to load those cattle immediately or first thing the next morning to get them, because they were having trouble with many lots you couldn't get trucks into because the bridges were out, roads were washed out, too muddy, couldn't do this, couldn't do that, and some of the cattle that they had planned to have for their scheduling weren't able to get in, so they was trying to get hooked up with some guys where they could get some cattle sent in there, and your cattle feeders were more than happy to work with them, even though you wonder what it would be like if the shoe was on the other foot. But we saw some trade continue at 127, where it had kind of died down, and then we heard of a little bit higher than that, maybe some 128. We'll find out how much of that happened. It might be more than what we realize as these Monday reports come in, and we'll talk about that on our next visit. But we saw more 204, where in the northern plains they were wanting to step back to 203, but we saw some more 204 dress trade and then kind of a call-in deal at 205, so we also saw some trade there too. But tell you what, everybody's trying to guesstimate what these death loss numbers are going to be when they come in. We'll probably never get a definite head count, but it's going to be staggering. I've heard some reports, people just throwing a dart at the wall saying 10,000 or tens of thousands. It's going to be in the hundreds of thousands. You think about all the cattle producers there, and there's a lot of them in Nebraska. It's one of our biggest states, and the lion's share of those are going to be spring calvers, and the lion's share of those spring calvers were going to be in high time calving this past week, because that's when they do it. They need to get most of these calves on the ground and get them started and get them going before it's time to start planting corn and getting their fertilizer down and everything. and so everybody was in high time of calving. And so you figure there's probably 2 or 3 days there, and I don't know if you've seen how much of Nebraska that flood encompassed, but it was almost the entire state. But if it wasn't deep snow, blowing snow drifts, or flood waters, or lakes or rivers out of their boundaries, it was almost the entire state. So it's covering so much of a big area. You figure all of those calves that were born for 2 or 3 days there, the majority of those calves didn't make it. And you talk about top producers that get stuff taken care of, even the ones that had good facilities, some of them couldn't save them. And you hear a lot more of them talking about losing cows. And then the cows and calves, and the cows that were trying to calve, that's not it. What about all the feedlots? You know, some of the worst flooding we saw was around Wisner, Nebraska. That is feedlot central. That is ground zero for feeding cattle right there, and maybe not in giant lots like you see in the southern plains, but they have a lot of smaller lots, and they might be listed as one feedlot, but they're on about every hillside when you walk around or drive around in that part of the country and look at them, and a lot of cattle just stranded. We've seen reports of some feedlots completely stranded that you couldn't get feed to them. And cattle wandering, you know, walking over their fences with drifted snow, or maybe just blinding in the bad winds and weather, and they just got together and pushed the fence down and then just start wandering. And you can't get the cattle rounded up. You don't know where they're at. A lot of them drowned, a lot of them suffering, and it's going to be very, very significant. And I think this is one cattle catastrophe that is going to make a play on the market. Box beef cutout values peaked last week for your early spring, late winter market, as they were going up early in the week and then going the other way at the end of the week, and we doubt we see a bounce back up over those highs. But your average trade for last week on choice cuts, $227.70. That was $2.76 higher than the average from the previous week. But your latest established quote on Friday was $226.99. So you see how it's tailing off. And then select your average trade for last week, $219.07, up 93 cents compared to the average from the previous week. But your last quote on Friday was $217.34. Your slaughter was down last week because of the storms, the wind, the floods. It affected your packers too. They weren't able to go as hard as what they would have liked to, and this is the time they really, really want to push. But 593,000 is all they got. That's 10,000 less than the previous week and 8,000 less than the same week a year ago. They're really going to want to crank it up here whenever things get back to semi-normal, if we get some of this flood and mess cleaned up. But look at your feeder cattle markets. Your real-time index on Cattle Market Central ended the week at 136.13. That was about $3 lower for the week. Your cash feeders and your auctions were sure $2 to $5 lower for the week on your feeder weights. Your calves and stocker cattle, where they were available, were unevenly steady, but it all had to do with the storms. And we talked about how most of your northern feedlots were just completely out of the market with the storm coming through. That was the last thing that they wanted to mess with, was new cattle coming in. But some of them that were buying some strings of cattle that they always like to get bought had told the sale barns that when they bought them that they were going to have to hold them for several days, knowing that the flood waters and the roads being out and just everything was going to keep them from being able to pick those cattle up. But we had a real nice weekend through the meat of the country, through cattle country over the weekend. As bad as that storm was last week, early last week, the weekend was really nice pretty much all throughout the central part of the U.S., and we should have some big receipts because a lot of these places are backed up with cattle that they haven't been able to get to the sale. And Joplin is expecting 6,500 on Monday. They'll probably beat that. Oklahoma City, the Oklahoma National Stockyards, were looking for up to 9,000 head, and they'll probably beat that too, because just absolutely perfect weather in that part of the country to get some cattle in that you weren't able to get in because of some earlier storms and bitter cold weather. But look at some individual quotes late last week on Friday in Torrington, Wyoming. They had a light sale, canceled their Wednesday sale and had a light sale on Friday due to all the storms. Only 1,300 head, but I tell you what, the stocker cattle were selling like hotcakes. 102 head of 598-pound stocker steers bring $183.50. That's $1,100 a head, guys. And then look down at Santa Teresa Livestock Auction, Santa Teresa, New Mexico. These are Mexican cattle coming north, right on the border there. They had a big sale, 2,750 head. That'd be a big sale for them. Got a nice new facility there. But look at some of these groups. Pulled this off Cattle Market Central. Look at some of these big groups of Mexican cattle coming north. You look how affordable the heavier weight feeders are there, but then when you get into the stocker weights, they're as high as cattle you see almost anywhere. But 55 head of 914-pound steers bring $113.50. 166 head of 785-pound feeder steers, $125.50, or I guess they could probably be turned out too, but be a lot of wheels to get under them. 163 head of 512-pound steers bring $174.50. And then 58 head of lightweight green feeder steers and thin, 422 pounds at $196. That's your feeder flash for Monday.